pleasure to be here. I think most of that reflected the fact that I've been doing this for a really long time, and which really is kind of where I want to start, because I want to sort of reflect back a little bit on some research that I've been involved in for longer than I want to remember probably. One of my favorite quotes is a quote from a Philip Roth novel called American Pastoral. And in this sort of opening section of the book, Roth is kind of remembering the character that he's writing, and you kind of think it's Roth. He's talking about going back to his high school in Newark, and it's like 50 years after graduated from high school. And he's sort of thinking about what is he going to say to his class from way back when. And what he winds up kind of saying is, that what's kind of astonishing is that back then, none of us could know how things would turn out. And now we know exactly how they turned out. So for better or worse, now we know. And so I want to use this way of sort of thinking a little bit about two research literatures that I've been involved in, and going all the way back to way back when I was in graduate school. I started out doing a dissertation and doing research on basic sort of issues of extra-legal attributes in criminal sentencing, race, class, disparities in criminal sentencing, discrimination, and so on. And the very first piece I wrote was kind of just a review of the literature, and it wasn't a very sophisticated literature at that time, and sort of just went back over it. And this paper, first paper I ever published, got cited over 600 times. And I thought, this is going to be easy, no problem. And so I worked in this field, sort of looking at these issues for about 10 years. And none of the papers I did ever got to anywhere near that level. And so that was kind of, sobering. And then kind of lightning hit again. Way later, 1999, wrote a paper. And this was about effects of parental incarceration on children. And again, this paper gets, the literature wasn't very sophisticated. But we tried to sort of bring it together. And this paper got cited again over 600 times. Well, it's almost the same number, right? This is kind of interesting, kind of strange. And then work in this field, for another 10 years, and same thing. Nothing ever comes anywhere close. And so I was kind of, thinking about this. And so I asked my older son, who's a lawyer, used to arguing about things and litigating or whatever. And, I asked him, I said, what's going on here? What do you think's happening? He said, Dad, it's pretty obvious. You just really know how to run a research literature into the ground. And I thought, okay, that may be true. That's interesting. But of course, any good social scientist can come up with another explanation. And so I busily set to work trying to understand what I thought might be going on in these literatures. And they were sort of similar in both having sort of a basic concern, the sentencing literature interested in particular about racial bias in sentencing, the parental incarceration literature interested in family effects, especially effects on children and spouses, and even beyond that, neighborhoods, but much less attention to the latter. So they kind of tended to be micro-level analyses and often got caught up in sort of statistical issues in the criminal sentencing literature. It was issue of selection bias, that we know that there's a lot that goes on before you get to the stage of sentencing, and what is it about those few cases that wind up compared to all those that start out that wind up in sentencing. And about the time social scientists, criminologists began to realize that that was kind of a problematic issue for understanding racial effects on sentencing, they also sort of got caught up in realizing how difficult this problem was to solve. Actually, one of my colleagues at the American Bar Foundation in Chicago, Jim Heckman, won a Nobel Prize for trying to find the solutions to these problems, and still talks a lot about how problematic these issues are. And in the parental incarceration literature, a lot of concern about unmeasured heterogeneity. What are the sort of factors that we've sort of not neglected in trying to understand what's going on in terms of the effects of parents being incarcerated on their children. Both these literatures, compared to their involvement with individual level, sort of micro level issues, have not spent a lot of time looking at the macro level effects of states or neighborhoods or schools as sources of variation in the outcome. And so that's the kind of the source of the title for this talk, A Tale Half Told, trying to argue that there's a whole nother dimension or a couple of other dimensions even that we need to be dealing with and understanding what's going on in terms of the effects of parental incarceration on children. This is an issue that's sort of received some significant attention specifically in the field of criminology, and particularly in the hands of Rob Sampson and William Julius Wilson. So both very prominent, the most prominent, I would say, criminologist in America, and one of the most prominent scholars of race in America. Two really, high-level functioning scholars working in these sort of interrelated fields. And basically, what they argue in an article that they published in 1995 and have recently updated within the last year or so, kind of done a sort of revisiting of the issues involved. They basically make an argument in this paper that only consider micro levels of analysis and neglecting the macro level of what's going on in terms of neighborhoods or states or even comparing countries, kind of misses a whole set of questions that we need to answer, and argue that basically it's a kind of, we talk about the ecological fallacy in social science, reasoning from aggregates to individuals, and they say, well, it operates the other way as well. If we only focus on the individuals and don't consider the aggregates, we're not really seeing the full range of effects and how they impact on outcomes. And so that's kind of the perspective that we're bringing to this literature on parental incarceration, that we need contextual level analyses as well. And in particular, what we're interested in this paper is the effects of states on outcomes and what's going on with the parents in terms of incarceration, what's going on in the children. We're particularly focusing on educational outcomes and trying to understand what's going on in maybe a broader way. So another way of sort of thinking about this is in terms of a concept or a phrase that's seldom used today, but has a kind of history in American politics and maybe in social science, I'm not sure. This idea of what was called creative federalism. And this literature, this concern in politics, has had to do with trying to sort of think about what goes on in America in terms of this tremendous variation that we have across states in terms of laws dealing with various kinds of social problems. And the idea of creative federalism was to try to get beyond this and try to provide some direction from the federal level that could remove some of this incredible amount of variation that occurs between states in all sorts of sort of policy outcomes. I think this is probably an issue that resonates with me because I lived about half of my life in Canada, which thinks of itself as being this huge landmass with a population about 1/10 the size of the United States. And so in Canada, You don't have state police or individual city police operating without a kind of federal direction. Whereas in Canada, you have classically the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who set, sort of an agenda on a broader level. And that's kind of one way of sort of visualizing the fact that most countries have more national direction than we do. We just have an incredible amount, and it goes all the way back to states' rights and issues of that kind in America. Now, if we try to think about what creative federalism might look like today and in relation to issues of mass incarceration, we might think of Eric Holder and Rand Paul, who are two individuals who a couple of years ago, maybe it's more than that now, but in any event, suggested they were going to team up and they were going to introduce federal criminal justice reforms that could have a big impact on states. I was a little incredulous from the beginning, and even more so when I tried to create this slide. I could never find a slide with Eric Holder and Rand Paul in the same place at the same time addressing this issue or any issue. So that made me a little skeptical. Now, on the other hand, my state of Illinois, my favorite senator is Dick Durbin in the center on the left-hand side here, who's been involved in a bipartisan effort to try to come up with reforms in federal criminal justice and set something of a standard or an example for the states. And I'd concluded that this must be, just over, that it wasn't going to happen. But I actually heard the other day that there's some suggestion that there is a bill that may come up in both Congress, both in the House and the Senate. So maybe that's not all over, but it sure hasn't happened yet. And it leaves lots of room to worry about what's going on across the many states of this country. And there's this further issue of how realistic is it to expect major reforms in the United States. Just recently, Mark Maurer, who many of you will know as the person who's developed this sentencing project, it's been enormously important and influential on issues of mass incarceration in the United States. Recently, his organization came up with an estimate that tries to visualize where we're going in terms of prospects for reform in criminal justice and mass incarceration. And one of the points that's sort of made is that, maybe we've turned the corner or bent the curve, I guess would be the metaphor, for what's happened over the last 5 to 8 years. About 2010, we started to have states that were reducing their levels of incarceration. But Maurer and his colleagues estimate that if we push this level of reduction that's going on, something on the order of 6% a year, if we push it out to the point where we would have about a half reduction in the level of per capita incarceration in the United States, we would have to go all the way out to the year 2100. Now, I'm going to be long gone by 2100, but so are all of the rest of you. And half reduction. I haven't gone, I don't know where, the other countries are that come right below the United States. But I'm guessing there aren't that many. Cutting it by half is still going to leave the United States perhaps way ahead and maybe still the highest level of incarceration. I should find that out for sure. But it's a sobering kind of reflection on the slowness of change that's coming and where we're going in terms of mass incarceration. If we try to see this on a state basis, sorry for this intervention in my slides, but I think it will only be a minor distraction. There are, of course, states like this one, California, that are reducing incarceration substantially. And So we have, what is it, the 2011 case, Supreme Court case, in which Justice Kennedy writes the majority opinion, Brown v. Plata, I believe it is, yeah, which mandates that California needed to reduce its level of imprisonment on the level of, I think, 30 to 40,000. And one way or another, with some slight twists and turns in terms of what's going on at the county level and so on, California has gone a long way in terms of its reduction of incarceration. And there are other states. New Jersey surprised me. I think of New Jersey organized crime, or, I don't know what I'm sorry if you're from New Jersey. I don't usually think of New Jersey as being the most progressive place in the world, but there's substantial reduction in incarceration, New York State, and some other states as well. But about half the states, since 2010, when there started to be levels of reduction, still about half the states are in the single digits of reduction in the last 7 or 8 years. I've forgotten the exact year that this is based on. And there are still about 10 or 11 states that are increasing their levels of incarceration. I recently gave a talk in Nebraska. Who knew? Nebraska is increasing its levels of incarceration. It's a big issue in Nebraska. If we look at it this way to sort of get a visual sense, we see, California, Texas, New York. We see some of these big states are making progress, but we see a lot of variation across the states. And so we've been interested in our research in trying to understand what's going on in terms of this state variation. Now, the other point I want to make is one that many of you may also know already, that actually about half of all the inmates in state and federal prisons, county prisons included in the United States, about half of these people who are in jail are parents. So we don't usually think of prisoners as parents, but we have about half of the population of prisoners actually who are parents, and this of course is largely a result of the about 10 times as many men who are in prison, about half of the men being parents, a much higher proportion of about the 1/10 of prisoners who are women. Many more of them, of course, are parents. If we look at it in certain terms of sort of the order of magnitudes of what's going on, the increase in the incarceration of children has been going up even faster than incarceration alone. And since many prisoners have multiple children, the numbers are up around, we're pushing towards 3 million. And if we spin that out, some of the demographers who are here today would be able to give a better indication. We're talking many millions of children impacted by the incarceration of their parents over this, if we think particularly, we sort of push out into the future to the time when we're all gone and we're still incarcerating half the population. This is going to be a lot of children who are affected. So the research that I'm going to tell you about today is based on a national study, national longitudinal study of adolescent, and now, because these subjects of this study have been followed for so long, it's now also called and adult health, and sometimes referred to as ad health. This study has been going on now since 1995, and it's a large and ambitious study. One of the interesting things about this study is that the principal people who were involved in it, Dick Richard Udry and Kathy Mullins Harris at the University of North Carolina, originally had this study fully funded, and it must have been in the tens of millions already in terms of projected cost at that time, during the first Bush administration. So when is that? The late 1980s. The study was ready to go, fully funded, instruments all developed, the research design in place, ready to go into the field. Research Triangle Institute in the three-city area in North Carolina was going to do it. And the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, I think it still was called then, at the last moment pulled the plug, said, not going to do this. His concern was it was a study designed to particularly focus on sexually transmitted diseases in a time still of great concern about AIDS and concerned about, presumably, about anonymity. In any event, that was the reason given. People at North Carolina kept on with this, and I was at the University of North Carolina in 1995. So they were kind enough to ask me to be on the advisory committee, and they're ramping up the new study. Actually, I think the first wave had already been done. They were designing the second wave. And so, you know, each of the people on the committee were supposed to make suggestions. And as many of you know, these large sample longitudinal studies, to get the level of funding that you need to do them, you have to cover a lot of different sort of problem areas so you can get different agencies contributing funding. I think Ad Health is now into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So, you know, sort of a contest. You're arguing with your colleagues on this committee about what to include. And so, you know, I'm a criminologist. The obvious question that was in my mind was to ask something about the incarceration of parents. And so that's what I suggested. I said, okay, you know, just one question. Has your father been in jail or prison? And they said, you know, this doesn't seem practical. It's just not going to pan out. There won't be enough people in this sample. And then the original sample is about 10,000. There just won't be enough people to make this worthwhile. I said, no, I think if we say jail and prison, I think you'll be surprised. I think we'll find actually there's a significant amount of variation. So the study is done across the United States, 132 schools. At that time, it was a mixture of middle and secondary schools. Spread across nearly all 50 states. I've forgotten the exact number, with the sample sizes in individual states related to the population of the state. So some of the state populations get fairly small. But there are a good 35 to 40 states in which there's significant representation enough to make the sample meaningful in those terms. And even in the early waves, which was beginning with adolescents who were on average 15 years of age, already at that point, I think about 18% of the African American population reported that a father had been incarcerated. By the fourth wave of this study, it's up to 24%, up to 18% for Hispanics, and about 13% even for whites. When they, you know, were pressing me initially to make an estimate, I suggested, oh, maybe 10%, and it definitely exceeded that. Another interesting feature of the Ad Health study, and why I particularly like working with it, and doing this work particularly with Holly Foster at Texas A&M University, is that by beginning with adolescents in 1995, what this meant was that they had on average been born in 1980. And so that means, you know, actually there's a famous article written in Criminology by Al Blumstein that was called A Test of the Stability of Imprisonment Hypothesis, which showed that up till from 1900 to 1980, it was kind of flat in terms of level of incarceration. And just about exactly the time that article was published, things took off. Can you imagine? You write that? I'm pleased to report that he had a successful career in any event, so things turned out okay. But in any event, These data are interesting in that they take us back to individuals whose family experiences date from the beginning of mass incarceration, and now the wave of data we're working with here was collected in 2015, and there's a fifth wave that's just beginning to be available. So we're interested in state variation and the rise of imprisonment, and we were particularly interested in an article done in the early part of 2001 by Catherine Beckett and Bruce Western, which is a wonderful piece of work. I like it a lot. And what it's pointing to is an argument that in about 1995, there sort of crystallized what they call a penal welfare regime in the United States. And the idea was that incarceration was going up, and pretty much at the same time, expenditures on welfare and education were coming down. And they were saying that you can think of both of these things as being punishment. Punishing disadvantaged parents in terms of welfare and educational support for their children, and of course incarceration. But there's also reason to think about the fact that there's lots of state variation, and all states aren't moving together and in the same way. Michelle Phelps recently has written a lot about this, arguing that there's a real distinction to be made between the rhetoric of mass incarceration and the practice of mass incarceration. So that there are many states where even though the politics may be all talked about in terms of punishment, actually there's still some success in maintaining some of the level of welfare and educational support. In the Beckett and Western paper, they have a table where they sort of single out the 10 most punitive states and the 10 most supportive states. And what they're particularly interested in, of course, is that these welfare cuts are going along with high levels of incarceration, much lower levels of cuts where incarceration is lower. But keep in mind, there are 30 states in between, and there's a lot of variation even within these top 10 and bottom 10. So state variation is still a big and important issue. So the question is, what are the contextual consequences of state variation in welfare and educational support for families and children? And whether states that provide more welfare and educational support for families and children might be successful in mitigating the effects of high levels of incarceration. And we're particularly focusing in this analysis on fathers. So we're sort of trying to play around with three different sort of ways of thinking about these issues. One has to do with social exclusion and thinking about what is the effect of being in a state where you both have rising levels of incarceration and declining welfare and educational support. We talk about this as kind of being a doubling down effect, potentially, on the children who are experiencing this. And we also want to think about inclusion, interested in states where you have continuing state investment in family and children with supportive kinds of programming, whether this can compensate for levels of father incarceration. So we're sort of thinking about something we sort of term institutional uplift. And there's a lot of, Bryant has done important work on inclusion, showing that a high proportion of the parents who experience imprisonment also experience involvement in supportive programming at the same time. So there's reason to think that inclusion is a part of this story as well. So both exclusion and inclusion. And then we want to sort of think about this in life course terms. And we're interested in sort of life course outcomes, particularly in terms of educational outcomes. And we're also interested in this sort of idea that's common in the life course literature. The idea of linked lives, that our parents, of course, have a big impact on our own lives. And a lot of research in this on social stratification, showing initially that fathers had big effects, and later on becoming more sensitive to the fact that actually mothers have big effects too, and back and forth about who had the bigger effects and so on and so forth. It's a little easier to study that in terms of stratification outcomes, educational outcomes, where you've got a lot of two-parent families. Harder to study it in terms of parental incarceration because in relative terms, about 10 times as many fathers get incarcerated as mothers. So we tried to do some work on the effects of maternal incarceration as well, but we're focusing here on paternal incarceration. We're interested in outcomes. We're particularly interested in using the data we're using because it tracks the outcomes a fair distance into adulthood. The adolescents who were 15 in 1995 are now into their 30s. So they're pretty much completed their educational careers. So this allows us to have a long-term consideration of actually how far the people in this study get in terms of educational outcomes. And this turns out, I think, to be important because over time in the United States, we've actually gotten a lot better at getting people through high school. But we're still got substantial variation in getting through college. And so in terms of looking at disparities, the disparities are showing up much more in terms of college completion than they are in terms of completing high school. So in this analysis, we focus on both college attendance and college completion, and expecting that really college completion is going to be the dramatic sort of difference. And there's an interesting op-ed in the New York Times about a month ago by David Leonhardt, I believe it is, who shows that while if you make comparisons to children born in the 70s and born in the 1980s, college attendance has been going up, even in the lowest income groups that we're most interested in terms of parental incarceration. But graduation rates have not been going up, almost not at all among the least affluent, and still not a great deal among the middle group, and really substantially rising among the most wealthy. What's interesting is that actually among the most wealthy, you seem to be seeing a slight level of reduction in college attendance, but we're up quite high in that group. And I'm interested in it because I have a nephew who's a star in the tech sector who left Northwestern after his freshman year and has done fabulously well. So I think, oh, there's my nephew. So, okay, in any event. So we have a few hypotheses that we're interested in. We're interested in the effects of grade retention, being held back in school, and we're interested in particular in making sure to take that into account, among other variables, in terms of looking at whether we think we're identifying an influence of parental, particularly paternal incarceration, net of things like being held back or experiencing grade retention. We're expecting that the negative effects are going to be stronger at college than at earlier stages. We're interested in distinguishing between what I called earlier the double disadvantage of being in a state where welfare and educational support are going down at the same time that imprisonment is going up, versus being in a state that is maintaining a fairly stable state in terms of welfare and educational support, and the possibility that this is removing some of the barriers to life course educational advancement. And then we're ultimately interested and the possibility that a higher investment in welfare and education can increase college completion even among youth who have been held back and are experiencing grade retention. We think this is a particularly interesting sort of focus for a couple of reasons, one of which is the important work of Turney and Haskins. Turney is here with us, who have shown some very significant effects of grade retention in secondary school, and actually hypothesized, if I remember correctly, that there will be an intergenerational impact. So we're interested in sort of plotting this out in these ed health data that go on into these educational outcomes into the youth who are now young adults, or even, I guess, if they're in their early 30s, they're sort of entering middle adulthood, maybe even. So, and we're interested in this idea that attention to issues like academic readiness and grade retention are being held back, that these are kind of intriguing, important, potentially, points of leverage in educational careers, where maybe if resources were available at this point in the life course, that they might actually be consequential in terms of extending educational careers. So the analysis, and I won't go into too much detail about the analysis, but just show you some of the principal results that we think are most interesting. This is kind of a multi-level modeling thing where you're looking both at its insta-level, individual level effects, and state level effects. And so we have a series of things at the individual, ranging all the way from the incarceration of fathers that we're expecting to have a significant negative effect, and it does, on educational outcomes, net of a range of other things, not only fathers' education, but also grade retention. At the state level, we're interested in particular whether educational and welfare support across states might have an impact in terms of outcomes. We also look at prison education programs. We find that both of these are having impacts that are of interest. And then we're interested in this moderation or interaction effect involving the possibility that in states that provide more welfare educational support will be perhaps also effective for some of the most disadvantaged youth who are experiencing retention. It's worthwhile just thinking quickly and briefly about the measures involved. We put together welfare and education because that's the way Beckett and Western do it in what we think of as their classic 2001 paper. And the interesting thing is you can sort of see the overlap between welfare support and education in terms of supplemental nutritional assistance, school lunch programs, kinds of things that you could readily imagine having a pretty significant effect on educational, sustaining educational careers and success. In the prisons, we're interested in the range of kinds of programming available across the penal institutions within the states that we consider. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of bring this to a conclusion by talking about a couple of the we think are the most interesting findings, or the results. These are done as sort of bar graphs, and these bar graphs represent taking into account a couple of variables in terms of what you're seeing, but they have in back of them the full range of the equations that I alluded to earlier. In this bar graph, we're interested in what the combined effects are of either having a father who has been incarcerated or has not been incarcerated in states which provide higher and lower levels of welfare educational support. And what we're seeing here is that on the right-hand side of the bar graph, we're looking at the children of incarcerated fathers. And we're seeing in states that have lower levels of welfare and educational support, something like 17% of the youth controlling for the other variables, setting other variables at their means, complete college. And in states that provide higher levels of, actually these are at the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile in terms of level of welfare and educational support. So in these states where you have higher levels of support, the kids whose fathers are incarcerated are doing better at the level of 25%. If we look at what we think of as more typical broader population in states that provide, there is a difference in states providing less support and providing more support. That's not significantly different than the level of difference on the right-hand side of the figure. So doing about 7 or 8% better and getting into the 30% range in terms of completing college. Okay, so the question, you might look at this and say, well, you know, that's great. Both kids who have parents who are incarcerated are benefiting from more state welfare and education support, but the kids who don't have parents incarcerated are benefiting, those children are benefiting as well. There's a current sort of universality of this. If you think of support for welfare and education in schools as being an issue of child's rights, children having a right to education, and this is a part of human rights discussions. You know, this makes, you know, there's an argument for universality and having this widely available. Sort of like the arguments that are made for Social Security, that everybody benefits, not just the disadvantaged, but I get Social Security now as well, so I'm for it. Yeah, okay, so then we wanted to look at this interaction effect, and there is this significant interaction effect. And what it's showing is that only about 6% of the kids who have a father incarcerated who are in states with low welfare and education support, only about 6% of them are graduating from college, but up around 15% in states that have higher levels of welfare and education support. So we're getting an effect that's rather substantial, and it's bigger for these kids who are having parents incarcerated than it is among the kids whose parents are not incarcerated. So this is a more specific kind of effect. But if you go back and you're sort of thinking about the earlier figure, you know, if you're thinking about, well, how could we get this 25% figure up closer to 31%? What the argument here is here, and consistent with, I think, Tierney and Haskins' intergenerational prediction and the sort of idea of linked lives in the life course and so on. You're seeing support for this expectation that there can be this kind of important effect for these young people. In the end, what we're saying is beginning with kind of a basic idea that it would see more of a sort of human rights kind of perspective. You know, children are innocent of the crimes of their fathers, yet they're significantly disadvantaged by their father's incarceration. So there's a kind of a human rights issue here. Looking at this at the individual level may be only part of the story. One macro level that we could look at involves states and the differential impact that we've talked about, particularly in terms of education and welfare support. That together these have consequences for children of incarcerated parents. First good news is state investment in families benefits children of incarcerated and unincarcerated fathers. Second, maybe good news, that targeting this investment on children who are held back or retained in school also can be especially beneficial. And of course, the bad news still is that in states that are both incarcerating more and supporting less, the kids are doubly disadvantaged. So where does this all leave us? Well, I have one final slide that, if I can get to it, will tell us the answer to that question. Or at least ask the question, will some US states become more like Canadian provinces than other US states in terms of what's going on, in terms of the children of incarcerated parents? And I'm interested in this because I spent half my life in Canada, and this is actually a map that's associated with an argument about that actually there are two Americas, and one part of America is sort of more a part of Canada than the United States maybe. And it's called the United States of Canada. So I knew you'd want to know about that. That's it. Thank you. I appreciate your patience. Yeah. So perhaps we have a few minutes for questions. If,
we have about 30 minutes for questions.
30 minutes, wow. Okay, that may exhaust you all, but yeah.
So throughout the presentation, and I think a lot of the articles that we read in class, you focused a lot on like the paternal incarceration, so fathers,
Yes.
and I think you do touch on, at least in here and probably in your articles too, about how maternal incarceration is has an effect, but it's not as large.
Yes.
Like that, and I just wanted to know, do you have any plans on like really diving deep into maternal incarceration, if not by itself, with like paternal incarceration, and seeing the effects of that?
So that's a great question. That's really the pressing question, I think, because there's good reason to think that maternal effects are really important. And they may express themselves in some different ways that are unique in terms of, for example, you know, when a father goes to prison, the kids usually stay with the mothers. When a mother goes to prison, they're much more likely to go into, what do we call it, foster care, or to stay with grandparents or relatives or something of the sort. There are differences, you know, that sort of relate to gender, and maybe that's an argument for doing the analyses separately. But it's also important to sort of have a sense of comparativeness. The good news is that we've had a series of grants from the National Science Foundation, and which is crucial because we have to pay to get our items on to each wave of the Ad Health study. And we're asking more and more questions about mothers. And so I think we're going to be able to answer those questions better. And the question is, you know, there's this very important work that you've probably read some of by Sarah Wakefield and Chris Wildeman. It's really, I think, some of the very best work in this field. And they sort of make an argument in their book that, you know, families in which mothers go to prison have a lot of problems. And the range of these problems means that whether you can attribute negative outcomes to the imprisonment of a mother, you know, maybe that, but it may be that, or it may be all the other things that go along with it. We think actually there's a good argument for the effects being larger than we would expect and significant. And a lot of this has to do with things like foster care as maybe an intervening or moderating variable, but we need better data to answer those questions. But we do have one paper in Law and Society Review in 2012 that tries to make this argument as strongly as we think we can make it. Yeah, so that's a really crucial question. Yeah.
So I have a question about the expenditures. Are they total or per capita?
That's an interesting question. We've done it both ways, and we're sort of doing more on that. In the analysis I presented to you, they're not per capita. That's an interesting point. So, and you're an expert on this, and so I'll ask you to maybe think a little bit about this. If we think about crimes in general, we're used to looking at crime rates, and we're used to looking at them per capita. And many problems of this kind we look at per capita. It's always kind of bothered me when I thought about car theft. Car theft's a big problem in California, I know now, at least in the Bay Area, but it must be in LA as well. Okay, so what's the relevant denominator there? Population or number of cars?
Well, you're talking about Brad's dissertation.
What's the answer?
We're still working on the answer, I think.
But you think it's a worthy question.
Well, I think that it's an
Yeah.
interesting question because, and the reason I asked the question is because a lot of the literature on, investments in children and certain program interventions show that there's a fade-out effect over time. And it strikes me as somewhat puzzling that with these early investments per capita, I would expect them to fade out by the time someone reached graduation, the point of graduation. And yet if they persist, then that's telling. And so I was wondering how you could possibly reconcile.
Yeah. So let me say two things. First, I'll answer my own question that you didn't ask, and then answer your question, but take this opportunity to do it. What particularly interests me about the interaction effect is, to me, what it's saying is, you got variation in expenditures across states. But in those states where those expenditures find their way into this group that are most perhaps at need, having experienced retention in school, that's where we should see the interaction effect, and we do. And this is sort of similar to me as like with the cars. If you do these calculations separately, I'm thinking it's going to show up more in the states where you do it with cars. Anyway. So you're talking about a fade. I like that term, fade-out effect. So I would argue just the opposite, though. In America, we have still the remnants of a public education system. We have a public education system to better or worse effect, varying across states. So there's lots of variation in that, but we do have an investment that at least has a prospect of getting kids through secondary school. And what we're seeing in the data is that more and more kids are getting through are graduating from high school. Upwards 80-90% graduating from high school, if I've got those numbers right. But college is getting more and more precarious, more and more expensive, and interruptions in it that make completion of college difficult, that might take a student out of college and back into the workforce to help with the family, or not just because of imprisonment, other reasons as well. That those are particularly crucial. So I think of it as more like a fade-in effect. And we haven't, we've got more work to do with these data. We haven't separated things out in terms of when the incarceration is experienced and so on.
That was going to be my next question, which was maybe there's a countervailing effect there between parental incarceration not fading out, allowing the investments to maintain its potency. I don't really know, but that's the only thing that can come to mind for me, other than the difference in per capita investments versus total investments.
Those are great points. What else can I tell you about parental education, a plague on America's stratification system? I just saw a presentation at Stanford last week by Raj Shetty. Yes, who's an economist at Stanford, and he's showing the vulnerability of black males in terms of stratification outcomes. And one of the things you can clearly see in his latest work is, the patterns look very similar in terms of that you can see that incarceration looks like it's probably explaining why black males are more vulnerable than black females in terms of stratification outcomes. So I think this is it's a big issue. Sure.
So my question sort of speaks to kind of everything in between the individual and the state, which is where I'm interested. interested
Yeah.
in like neighborhoods and families and cities. And so I guess I'm wondering, are there other levels
Yeah.
at which
Wow. Yeah.
these findings may go astray in one way or another if you account, I mean, I think about returning back to a certain kind of neighborhood with all its advantages or its, you know, disadvantages, and how that may impact how the state trickles down to the individual in
Yeah.
terms of these interaction effects. And
Yeah.
is there a way to get it? I mean, I've used
Oh,
that
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So have you thought about these other levels and what you might focus on?
Yeah. So I think the first one that at least interests me the most is using the school as a level of analysis. We actually,
Schools in there, yeah, of course.
yeah, so we have an earlier paper showing what we refer to as spillover effects, which I guess economists talk about. And we show that in schools with higher proportions of incarcerated parents, the effects are bigger both for the kids whose parents aren't incarcerated and those who are. So school level is an obvious, and you know, we can, at the school level, there's a lot of information in Ad Health. There's a special sub-study done using school administrative data, you know, getting information from the school. So for example, whether there are particular programs aimed at something like retained students. Yeah, so a 3-level model that
Yeah, and not to necessarily measure I mean, I get the complexity part,
Yeah.
but just in terms of where to put the efforts from a policy standpoint,
Mhm.
right? I mean, is the state the best place to get the most, you know, leverage, or is
Yeah.
it really something more localized, like the neighborhood or the school?
Yeah. So I think of it as, at the moment, the level that's most under pressure involves the states because we've got a administration that's invested in the deconstruction of the administrative state, and including welfare and education.
Although, did you see the New York
Prominently.
Times article today?
Yeah.
Trump claims
No.
that he would support criminal justice reform at the federal level.
Even though Jeff Sessions is doing something different.
Right.
And even
Yeah,
though
we'll talk about
And even though they're projecting that the federal
complexity.
prisons are
Yeah.
going to see an increase in incarceration.
Yes, and that Trump changes his mind from day to day. Yeah, but that's I haven't seen that article. Yeah, okay.
So I guess following on Charis's question, I was thinking about it on the other side, the punishment side, the variations county by county, and the punishment really is a county process, as is some of the implementation of the social
Yeah.
policies. And so whether you get at least some more specificity if you work at the county level, and I don't know. I know the Ad Health data just from a distance. I don't know how
Yeah.
much you can specify there at the county level.
Well,
So that's an interesting question. I know, there's this heavy emphasis on anonymity for reasons I explained earlier, and you have to use these composite variables that blur what states you're looking at. But I don't know how that relates quite to counties.
well, I think in Ad Health, you can't use counties or neighborhoods because of the way in which the data were sampled.
Right, but you,
Otherwise, your standard errors will be wrong because they started the sampling based on the school districts,
Right.
schools. And so that's the only meso level
Right.
that you could really get at.
Oh, that's interesting.
And Sam Lucas has a paper on this issue. Called
Really?
An Inconvenient Data Set.
Precisely.
Just saying, where people have used various data sets and
Yeah.
abused them in a number of ways, and Ad Help is one of these ways in which it has been abused
Right.
using neighborhoods to make certain claims.
Oh.
It's really
Yeah.
an issue about schools.
He's saying states are okay, or it's states and schools are okay. Okay, so far, yeah. Other problems, but yeah. An inconvenient study, I like
And
that.
data set.
Or data set, nice, yeah. Jeff, yeah.
John, I'm interested in the outcome of college graduation,
Yeah.
which is a proxy for mobility
Yes,
opportunity, but we know there's
Yeah.
tremendous variation in a number of things. One is the, let's say, value of various college degrees
Mhm.
to labor market access opportunity. And another wrinkle is, which you mentioned, was financing college. Is there any
Yeah.
ability to tease out those kinds of differences? I was thinking about,
Yeah.
for example, your nephew who
Yes.
left Northwestern, but
Yes.
leaving Northwestern after a year and leaving University of
Right.
Phoenix or something. And so are all these colleges kind of grouped together in Ad Health, or is there the
Yes.
ability to parse those? And is there ability to assess things like debt related to college education? Because that would seem to be a factor that would dampen the good
Yeah,
news.
that is really, I actually had not thought of that. That is a really interesting factor to put into this. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Well, I suspect, at the college level. I don't know. There may not be.
An article, I think it was in the New York Times, about the failure, this sort of persistent race wealth gap being attributable in part to the much larger proportion of black students, college students, who are borrowing money for college education.
Aha.
And undoubtedly that story is amplified when
Yeah.
in this population, I would think. Or,
Yeah.
and children with incarcerated parents may be more likely, for a number of reasons, to be tracking into schools where their returns on the investment are on average less.
Yeah, I think the school.
Heckman has a paper on that.
I'm sorry, who does?
Jim Heckman has a paper on
Oh, does he? Really? Oh, glad you told me that. Okay, Jim's sensitive. All right. Look at that. Yeah.
Kristen and then Brad.
So Brian's given us all sorts of suggestions for readings. I've already found this inconvenient data set paper. But my question is about, so you talk about grade retention as being a possible mechanism, and that seems plausible to me. I was also thinking about other potential mechanisms.
Yeah.
though, such as like family income being one, right? So father goes to prison or jail, and obviously that has a big impact on family finances, which may make college attendance and completion sort of
Yeah.
less likely. I was also thinking about like thinking about Linda Burton's idea of adultification. So this
Mhm.
idea where children sort of take on adult
Right.
responsibility sooner
Yeah.
than they may otherwise.
Right.
You know, so maybe become parents or leave their home of origin to
Right.
start their own households and things like that. And so I was wondering if you had thought about other mechanisms
Yeah.
and or had tested other ones.
Yeah.
Or if they maybe allow for some of that.
Yeah, so we haven't gotten very far with this, but I like the adultification one because it's kind of got a life, Linda Burton stuff, is
Yeah.
life course in that, age stage kind of thing, and it fits with a fade in instead of a fade out effect, yeah. So that's really interesting, yeah. And parental income data would be interesting to look at, and the stability of parental income. Interruptions in employment and so on. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering about the kind of minimum degree of incarceration or the length of incarceration that might qualify under the survey as a 1 in terms of parent ever incarcerated.
Yeah.
So just getting a sense of how much variation there might be in the treatment, the degree of incarceratedness for the parents.
Yeah.
Is the criteria such as, any time more than 24 hours in jail or
Yeah.
prison custody, or is it something that having a parent who is arrested and charged with a DUI on a Friday night and cannot be processed until Monday morning,
Right.
does that qualify, and how much might the treatment effect be potentially washed out by smaller, less treated ones
Yeah.
being in the data set?
Yeah, so there is information of that kind in Ad Health that in the later waves we've been able to get in there, both basically the offense seriousness of the parent and then length of sentence. We've looked a bit at it, and we've not been finding much, which I kind of, but the length of incarceration is particularly interesting because that sort of gets into the interruptions in employment and income and instability of families and so on. There are definite effects of single parent, which is controlled in these analyses, but there's a lot more to be done with that. Yeah, that's
Because it makes sense to me that
yeah,
looking at the mere contact with the incarcerative system,
yeah,
estimating the effects simply from the smallest unit of incarceration
Yeah.
that you can experience, but
Yeah.
also, you might see a minimum threshold of that effect being felt.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
Or it might actually allow you to do some placebo tests
There you go.
to rule out,
Hmm.
to see how robust the findings are
Hmm.
to different levels
Yeah.
of incarceratedness.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Oh, that's very helpful. Yeah,
Any other
Thank you.
questions, Professor Hagan? Well, thank you for
thank you. Yeah.